Okay, so we left off in the last recording on a consideration of Hans Jost's Schlageter, or I'm sorry, I can't remember the title of his play, but this famous play that was lauded by the Führer himself, and Hans Jost was the receiver of a medal, and I believe that it was totally sincere. Um, that let's say if we consider this, I won't go into it now, but remembering that poetry is a big theme that has in some way to do with the prototype thinking, the thinking of dunamis or future, or that which is in the emptiness, which is here indicates what can be filled out by the future. The poet has wisdom in this regard. So, well, let's put it this way. If somebody makes a verse and it rhymes and it's kind of nice or whatever, that's not poetry. Poetry is where we can assume that there's a wisdom in what's written. So I think that the Reich, the Dritte Reich, the Third Reich, um, Hitler and his fellows, um, recognized Hans Jost as a poet in this sense, as showing a certain wisdom. So we can reject that or not reject that, but I believe that they sincerely saw it this way. And what he was saying is this famous line, which we have will compel ourselves to hear the truth, however tedious it may be, and however say marginal it may be, but it's nonetheless so that what was meant by this famous line that's always ubiquitously, monotonously quoted about in the it's something along the lines of whenever I hear of culture, I release the safety on my Browning. But this is translated. This has been modified, as it were, to be more pithy. Something like when I hear the word culture, I reach for my gun, something like that. So this is everywhere misrepresented. What it means here is that the Kultur program of the liberals, which the conservatives were opposing, which had to do with supervision over the educational process, was refused. So this is the side that Hitler was representing. And it's not just the Nazis who took this view, but Walter Rathenau, who was Jewish, who was a Jewish politician and businessman, took exactly the same view. He said, the French have hoisted this system on us, meaning after World War One, at the conclusion of World War One. Rathenau doesn't say this, but I say this in parentheses. It was obviously done as reprisal for what happened in 1870 in the Franco-Prussian War. So now the French have come out on top, and they're gonna. The German has to, the Hun has to take their the comeuppance now. So they're hoisting this. So now let's take again from what Rathenau says. He says nobody wanted this constitution, the Weimar Constitution, which somehow to sort of mind screw the general mentality even more. The the sort of synthesized Goethe, the great hero Goethe, um, the poet Goethe, poet and thinker and politician and polymath Goethe. The They called it the Weimar Constitution in order to link it to Goethe, who was sort of in some ways straddling the French and the German world, just simply because he was such a expansive personality. But so Rathenau says nobody wanted that. This isn't the way, and basically all the forces were against it. So it's almost like entrapment in a certain way. You almost couldn't help there be a great struggle and conflict because they were straddled with laws and a system that didn't agree with the earlier system, although, and even with what the liberal Protestants wanted, the profession as represented by the professional classes. Because we have here absolutism in some way, total supervision over everything by the House of Hohenzollern and its ministers, Bismarck first among them, or this releasing of supervision of the education system to the professional classes themselves, which would include Nietzsche then as a professor, although he was a professor in Switzerland. But nonetheless, you can see that there'd be some sympathies there to the professional class, not to he was not a member of the nobility or the Junker class. So that's complex in there. Heidegger speaks. So Heidegger grew up at the end of the Prussian system, and he had to, but he was a peasant. So peasant has sort of a double meaning here. So if we're doing a class analysis, in that being a peasant was also a juridical, had a juridical status. There was something like a weighted vote in Prussia where the upper class, if you think of just like the French system with the three estates, each estate had different positive legal rights. So in the same way in Prussia, still in Heidegger, still up until World War I, still in Heidegger's formative period, there were, and in Leo Strauss's for that matter, there was a weighted vote. There's more power, political power to the upper classes, less to is sort of the bourgeois, which had inherited the Burgermeister position, I guess, the burghers, the position of the burghers. And then there were the peasants. So this is like, there's a positive legal meaning to these terms, aside from what we would think of as peasants as being sort of hardy stock of the land or whatnot, depending on how you look at it. Of course, peasant can also be simply a depreciatory term, right? Sort of similar to the French villain or villains, it being originally a name for the lowest class legally, I believe. So in that sense, Heidegger is an outsider to the political dynamics, which then in some way you could say corresponds to a certain freedom of thought, like, Rousseau was in some way an outsider too. He was maybe his mother or something had some influence, but he was a bastard child, and his father was I think a clockmaker or something, a watchmaker, who was largely self-educated. There's this idea of the outsider as the conscious of a society because they're free of the forces in it. Somewhat in this way, Nietzsche is sometimes painted as though you were an outsider. That's an interpretation. All right, so there's somewhat different. There's some suggestions about a possible sense to the class analysis understanding of the matter. Ultimately, we have before us just the notion of so-called genetic fallacy, although this is again something that withdraws. You can't necessarily treat this way of regarding rationality as correct. The source of something can be, in some sense, reasonably understood as being important. Maybe it's the most important thing. But from the point of view of the way logic developed in the Middle Ages, you have this idea of a genetic fallacy, and you have it in some sense even in Socrates, that you can't say something's wrong merely because of the source. And therefore, whatever Heidegger's history is, whatever Nietzsche's history is, those are simply the qualifications for whatever view they came in with, just as I suppose having eyes is necessary for the eyes of the soul to become operative, right? In that theory, I can't have the last word. There's simply the conditions for the possibility of this view coming into our grasp. I want to do something more on the inceptive thinking, try to do a real example of it with physics, for instance. So what does Heidegger mean by inception? What is inception here? Apparently, Anaximander he regards as the first beginning. He says Anaximander was the first to raise his eyes. So this is like 550 BC or so 2,550 years ago. The ground that Heidegger covers, it should be said, I suppose, is relatively small. So Nietzsche is about the long run. He constantly wants to think about these endless periods of the development of the human being prior to what we now think of as civilization, which may be only, some very limited number of generations or not that many, it's only like 40 lifetimes or something if you judge by full lifetimes that Heidegger is thinking about. He's not talking about 70,000 years. He's not talking about huge stretches. So that's a major difference, I think, difference in a major way between Heidegger and Nietzsche's way of grasping something. Intermediary between that would be somebody like Marx or so. You could regard Marx's theory also as an ontic theory, which is true in its own way with respect to the, as I was saying before, to the class analysis. There's some truth in that. The origin of things has something to say for itself, or there seems to be some truth in that. And anyway, reflecting on that and then reflecting in other tones seems to grant us some increase in meaning, through the transfer of meaning. Now, inception. So there's this grand inception of the Greeks, which seems to have a lot to do with the modalities for Heidegger in Ousia, which is for the Anaximander fragment seems to be interpreted this way by Heidegger. But what is inception on the whole? What does that mean on the whole? So I try to give an example that's a little bit closer to us. So Heidegger usually didn't speak of Einstein so far as I know, but he spoke of the men that were comparable, Max Planck and Heisenberg. So these are all men that had profound philosophic training. So they weren't just physicists, but they still spoke in the same language as the tradition that Heidegger was part of, that Husserl was part of. Husserl himself was a mathematician who was of the first caliber and did some work on a subject which is largely not too much touched upon, but how we get to the conception of number, first of all, out of life, or what the relationship between the proper thinking of number as such is to the life world, to life. How does that inception proceed? How does that beginning proceed? So I'll give an example from Einstein. Einstein thought for, I think it was 11 years or so, about something that he witnessed, a man falling from a cathedral, and his thinking was inceptive in that he tried to bring to his intuition, bring into himself this direct language of seeing the earth as rising up, as leaping up towards that man, rather than the man as falling to it. And this was, let's say, more Galilean than Galileo. So Galileo was the inception point in a small way comparable to the way Anaximander was to the whole tradition. Galileo was to the modern development of the modern mathematical physics the inception point, and his inception point was the thought project. How do you call this? The prototype, the thought prototype of the inertial frame of reference. So that the person on a ship floating out from the shore, with respect to other people on the deck of that ship under the gleam of the mast, is not, he doesn't detect any movement in those relations, but the person seeing it from the shore can note the background and can note the changes with the shore and can note these changes in a different position. Being doesn't move. Being is always still. The strongest presentation of that is that we're standing still now, even though we know in some sense, quote unquote, know that the Earth is spinning around its axis. There's something about this I think in the Baron von Munchausen writings, where they're talking about who can really grasp that the Earth is spinning around its axis. It's totally different than just having the words or just believing it or something like that. Entering into the inception of that thinking. So in the same way, there's this inception thinking of the idea of an inertial frame of reference in an absolute vacuum, which is close already to Cartesian thinking, which we're going to get to in the next recording, how that helps us to think through Husserl and Heidegger, and then vis-a-vis Nietzsche. But this is inceptive thinking is a going into the intuition, but such that the thing lights itself with the prototype for the first time. So we had to think all these factors at once. And again, it's hard to get all the higgledy-piggledy of it. I've given up the possibility of that. Heidegger is more like a marathon, so you have to keep with it and then hope that eventually you enter into this flus or the river of it, and that we can see the way he's trying to come upon the inception, which is still right before us. It's not that it happened on the timeline and in Anaximander, but the Anaximander thing is still bursting, at the risk of using these metaphors, which may be throwing us in the wrong direction. But it is true that the metaphors with physics, such as that say that the cosmic background radiation is everywhere. It's like that with the Anaximander inception. It's everywhere. It's not just that it was there in terms of the timeline, but that it's the essence of the way that we're intuiting everything. So remember that Einstein learned to intuit things differently in order to then inform the way he would do his calculations in his theory of general relativity. So let's leave that as meditation on a possible avenue of invasion into Heideggerian thinking for the moment, and we'll continue as we go on.